Hello. Did you know that in biblical thinking, name equals authority, but name also equals fame? So, by obscuring the name of the Creator, Satan attempts to interfere with the Creator's authority, and Satan attempts to interfere with the Creator's fame. Let me show you. Jews have replaced the name of the Creator with Adonai, and even Hashem, while Christians have replaced the Creator's name with Lord. And how about Pan, Zoti, Her, Uram, Shoda Prabhu in other languages? Can you see the confusion? Do you see the interference? Therefore, in this video series, we will focus on the original Hebrew name of the Creator, Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. Numerous topics and arguments will be investigated and tested against authentic Hebrew manuscript evidence. Thanks to Justin, my son, who prepared these topics and who will also be presenting these topics. My name is Piet van Rensburg. Please visit us at HebrewGospels.com.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the series on Nehemiah Gordon and the pronunciation of the Tetragrammaton Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. This is session number 7, part B of 8 technical linguistic proofs from the Masoretic text itself that the vowels on the name, the vowels Shua, Cholam, Kametz, are the vowels of Adonai. So in the previous session, we looked at the first 3 evidences that prove the vowels on the name belong to Adonai. Today we want to look at 5 more evidences in which the scribes themselves tell us by their pointings whether these vowels belong to the name or whether they belong to Adonai. And we also want to talk more about this B52 bomber argument. Remember, Nehemiah Gordon says that this rafeh on the hey, this line above the hey you can see on the screen, he says this proves definitively that these are the vowels of the name of the Creator. Let's start with this argument. We'll start with a video clip of Nehemiah Gordon where he talks about this argument in the B52 bomber, and then we'll look at this B52 manuscript and test Nehemiah's argument to see whether it is true or not.
So when the final hey of a word is silent, sometimes the scribe wrote a line over it to indicate that. That line is called rafeh. It shows you the hey is silent. In fact, in the example I'm showing here with La Yehovah, you see the word isheh, which means fire offering, and the hey in isheh is silent, so they wrote a line over it. They didn't always do it, but often they did it in some manuscripts. Now, in this La Yehovah and 5 other manuscripts, 6 manuscripts, there's Yehovah with a line over the hey that shows you the final hey is silent. Okay, no problem. But if those are the vowels of Adonai, the y, the final letter of Adonai, is not silent. And so there's no way that line, that Raphael line that tells you the last letter is silent, can have anything to do with Adonai. This proves definitively that these are the vowels of the name of the Creator of the universe, of the Father.
Okay, so this argument looks very convincing. It sounds very good. Is it true? Let's look at the B52 manuscript and test Nehemiah's argument. So, remember, one cannot read this as La Yehovah and translate this as to Yehovah. Remember, I explained this to you in the previous session. The vowel here on the preposition and the shua next to it tell us that these vowels cannot belong to the name Yehovah. They come from Adonai, and that's covered in session number 6. Today we want to talk about this rafeh on the hey. So let's first of all understand what Nehemiah's argument is. Let's look at the word Adonai in this B52 manuscript. Here you can see the word Adonai. The final consonant is a yod, and it never takes a rafeh. It never takes this line above it. And yet here on the name, we do have a line. And this is supposed to prove definitively that all the vowels you see on the name are authentic and belong to the name itself, and they do not come from Adonai. That's the argument. Now the first logical test to do is to look at the vowels of Elohim, to look at the name when the scribes place the vowels of Elohim on the name, and see what happens. So here's an example of this, Deuteronomy 3 verse 24, and Moses says, Adonai Yodewah, and remember, by tradition this is not read as Adonai Adonai, it's read as Adonai Elohim. The scribes place Elohim's vowels on the name, and yet what do we see on that final Hey of the name Yodewah? We see a line above it. We see the Rafeh above the final Hey. Does this Rafeh prove that all the vowels we see on the name are authentic and they belong to the name itself? No, these vowels come from Elohim. Let's look at the word Elohim. There you can see the word Elohim in the B52 manuscript. There is no line above the mem, the final consonant of Elohim. So yes, this Rafeh does not come from Elohim, and it does not come from Adonai, but yet the scribe still placed this on the name when he put Elohim and Adonai's vowels on the name. And this does not prove that the name is Yehovah. So then how could it prove that the name is Yehovah? Why did the scribe put this line above the final Hey of Yodewah? And by the way, in this manuscript, the placing of the Rafeh is inconsistent. Let's look at some examples. Here are some examples where you can see the name with Adonai's vowels with no Rafeh on the Hey. There you can see the name with Adonai's vowels with the Rafeh on the Hey. And now there you can see the name with Elohim's vowels without a Rafeh on the Hey. And in the previous slide we saw Elohim's vowel to the name with a Rafeh on the Hey. So this Rafeh stripe is inconsistent. But why did the scribe often place it on the name? Because this particular scribe had the habit of often placing this Rafeh on any final Hey. Let's just look at another example. I want to show you that even in other words this Rafeh stripe is inconsistent. Here we have the word Bama, and it has a Rafeh above the final Hey. Here we have the word Irashena, and we do not have a Rafeh above the final Hey. It makes no difference. It comes and goes. It makes no difference. Now, look at this phrase we have here, Adonai Yodewah. Remember, this is read as Adonai Elohim. Now, let's apply Nehemiah's argumentation here and see whether it works. We're going to test his argument using the vowels of Elohim. So here you can see the name Yehovah with the full vowels, and it has what's called a Rafeh on the final Hey here. Now, in Elohim, the final consonant, the mem, is never silent, and it never has a Rafeh written above it. And yet here in the name Yehovah, there is a Rafeh above the final Hey, telling you it's silent. And this proves definitively that the vowels here on the name are not the vowels of Elohim, they're the vowels of the name Yehovah. That is Nehemiah's argument when we test it with the vowels of Elohim. It holds no water. It doesn't work. The argument is flawed. This Rafeh stripe comes and goes and makes no difference to the pronunciation of the word, and also it does not prove that the vowels you see on the name are authentic. This is a flawed argument. So in the previous session we discussed that these three evidences work even in the B52 manuscript. Even in the B52 manuscript, these three evidences tell us that the vowels on the name belong to Adonai, they do not belong to the name itself. And we also discussed that Nehemiah Gordon has never shown any manuscript evidence to prove that the name is Yehovah with the prepositions or with this phrase Adonai Yodewah. We've never seen any Masoretic manuscripts that always read Adonai Yehovah and Yehovah Adonai and never change to Elohim's vowels. We've never seen any Masoretic manuscripts that read Lihovah, Bihovah, Kihovah, Wihovah, and so on. There's no evidence for it. All the evidence we have say these vowels belong to Adonai. Now today we want to look at 5 more evidences. 5 more ways in which the scribes themselves tell us by their pointings that the vowels on the name belong to Adonai. So let's start with number 4. The first evidence we'll be covering today, the min preposition. And we're going to look at some rules of pointing, just as in the previous session. We're going to base our rules on factual manuscript evidence, and we will see that this preposition is pointed differently next to a word that begins with ye than next to a word that begins with a and a aleph, as we have in Adonai. So let's start with rule number 1. The pointing of the min preposition when attached inseparably. So when the min stands on its own as a separate word, it's always just min. But when it's attached inseparably to the following word, there is a very definite, specific system of pointing. So rule 1a is chirek on the mem and doubling dagesh into the following consonant. Let's look at some examples here. We have chitzai midam, my arrows with blood. So this preposition min can have many different meanings. It can mean from, away from, with, more than, many different meanings depending on the context, but one very specific system of pointing. So this mem you see here represents the preposition min. Whenever we attach this inseparably to a word, the nun drops away. That nun there, the final nun, always drops away when we attach this inseparably to the following word. Here we have the chirek, the one dot underneath the line, and that is the doubling dagesh or the dagesh chazak into the following consonant, with blood. Alright, let's look at some more examples. Here we have mitzarao, from his enemies. The pointing is chirek plus doubling dagesh into the following consonant. And the final example here, mi Sinai, from Sinai, a chirek and a doubling dagesh in the following consonant. Okay, now how did the scribes point this preposition when attached inseparably to a word that begins with a yod and a simple shua, a word that begins with ye, as we would have in Yehovah? Let's look at some examples. The mem still has a chirek, but now we have a contraction. Let's look at some examples here. If you start reading this word at the yod, if you remove this min preposition from it, and you start with a yod, you have ye mino. It means his right hand. That is the simple shua it normally takes. So you have ye mino, his right hand. Now we attach the min preposition inseparably to this word, and we have, theoretically, we have mi ye. And just like li Yehoram contracts to li Horam, and we covered this in the previous session, so mi yemino becomes mi mino. That shua drops away, and the yod forms part of the vowel chirek, and we have mi mino. Okay, let's look at some more examples. In the next line, we have the name Jericho, in Hebrew, Yericho. If you start reading with the yod, it's Yericho. But if you attach this min preposition, you have mi ye, theoretically, but that always contracts to mi, and we have Miricho. Now we get to a very important example, the name Yehudah. The name Yehudah is very similar to the name Yehovah in spelling and in vowels. So, let's look here at Yehudah. Without the prefix min, it would be Yehudah with a simple shua underneath the yod. Now we attach this min preposition inseparably to the word, and we get mi ye, and it contracts to Mihudah. So if the name is Yehovah, similar to Yehudah, and it begins with ye, and we attach this min preposition to the name, we will find Mihovah, just as in Mihudah. So let's fill this into our table. If the name is Yehovah, we will find in the manuscripts Mihovah, just like we saw in Mihudah. How was this pointed next to an aleph? How would this be pointed next to the word Adonai? Let's see. Rule number 2. This min preposition is pointed with a tzerei next to an aleph, and the aleph as a guttural letter always rejects the doubling dagesh. Let's look at some examples. Here we have me'ayin, from where? This mem is the min preposition, the nun always drops away. The aleph always rejects the doubling dagesh, and the vowel changes here on the mem from a chirek, 1 dot, to a tzerei, 2 horizontal dots, me'ayin. Let's look at some more examples. Here we have me'eretz, from a land, and the pointing here on the mem is a tzerei, and the aleph as a guttural letter, of course, rejects the doubling dagesh. Now we get to an important example. So although we don't have in the Hebrew Bible Mei Adonai, we have this example Mei Adonau. Mei Adonau means from his Lord. Mei Adonai would mean from my Lord. And remember, Adonai and Adonau are spelt the same way in vowel points, and all we need to do is to delete that vowel at the end of the word Adonau, and we have Mei Adonai. We know that this would be pointed as Mei in front of Adonai because the first consonant of the word Adonai is an aleph, and we also know that the aleph also rejects the doubling dagesh. So let's fill this into our table. Mei Adonai with tzerei on the mem versus Mihovah with chirek on the mem. The scribes are going to tell us by their pointings whether the name is Yehovah or whether they placed Adonai's vowels on the name. We don't need to guess, and we don't need to argue about it. All we need to do is to study the Hebrew Bible manuscripts, and they will speak for themselves. So let's look at the Hebrew Bible manuscripts, and the scribes are going to answer this question. We'll start with the Aleppo Codex. What vowels did the scribe place on the name? The vowels of Mei Adonai with 2 dots underneath the mem, or the vowels of Mihovah, as we saw in Mihuda, with 1 dot underneath the mem. Let's see. Here we have Mei Yodewahei with 2 dots underneath the mem. So these are the vowels of Mei Adonai, not the vowels of Mihovah. Let's look at some more examples. Isaiah 40, we have Mei Yodewahei. So they read this and they put the vowels of Mei Adonai here on the name, not the vowels of Mihovah. Last example here from the Aleppo Codex, Mei Yodewahei. So the scribes are telling us by their vowel points that the vowels on the name belong to Adonai. Is this just someone's opinion or hypothesis? No, we know how the scribes would have pointed this next to Yehovah. We know because we can look at the Aleppo Codex and we can see that when a word begins with a yod and a simple shua, and we attach this min preposition, it becomes mi. It's never Mei. Never. There's no such thing in Hebrew as Mei Yehovah or Mei Yehuda. That doesn't exist. It's always mi. Here, Yericho becomes Miricho, not Mei Yericho. Yehuda becomes Mihuda, not Mei Yehuda. So this is not just a theory, it's a fact that the scribes of the important Hebrew Bible manuscripts pointed the mem with the chirek next to a word that begins with ye and not with the tzerei. So let's look at some more Hebrew Bible manuscripts, and these Bible manuscripts tell us that the vowels on the name belong to Adonai. Here's the Leningrad Codex, Mei Yodewahei with a tzerei on the mem. Cairo Codex, Mei Yodewahei with a tzerei on the mem. British Library Oriental 4445, Mei Yodewahei with a tzerei on the mem. All these scribes are indicating for us by their pointings that they moved the vowels of Mei Adonai onto the name. The vowels on the name belong to Adonai. Here we have the Sassoon 507 called the Damascus Crown. We have Mei Yodewahei with tzerei. Sassoon Codex, Mei Yodewahei with tzerei. All the important Bible manuscripts agree that these vowels belong to Adonai. Now let's look at the Petersburg Codex, which is pointed with Babylonian vowel signs. And so although they did not actually place vowels on the name, this vowel here is the equivalent of tzerei, and it belongs to the consonant to the right-hand side. It belongs to the mem. So they also read Mei. In other words, they read Mei Adonai. They did not read Mihovah. So all the manuscripts agree that the vowels on the name belong to Mei Adonai. They do not belong to Mihovah, and the scribes are telling us by their vowel points. We're not guessing. The scribes are telling us. Let's look at evidence number 5, the sheen relative particle. This sheen means who, whom, which, that, and so on. It's basically the shortened form of the word asher. Now let's look at some rules of pointing for this sheen. And to keep it simple, we'll only talk about the pointing next to Yod and next to Aleph, because that's all we need to know. Yehovah would begin with Yod, and Adonai begins with Aleph. So that's all we need to know. So next to Yod, it's pointed with Segol and a Dagesh into the following Yod. So here we have the Sheen relative particle, that is the Segol, those 3 dots. That is the doubling Dagesh in the Yod. And we have She Yechonenu, that He is gracious to us. So if the name is Yehovah and it begins with Ye, with Yod and Shua, we will find, just as we see here in She Yechonenu, we will find She Yehovah with Segol and a doubling Dagesh in the Yod. Okay, let's look at some more examples. Here we have She Yochez, who grasps, a Segol on the Sheen, and a Dagesh, a doubling Dagesh in the Yod. Now the only exception here is the PL. It's actually a well-known exception that a PL imperfect that begins with Yod and Shua rejects the doubling Dagesh of the wa consecutive, also of the Sheen relative particle and of the pronoun ma. It's a well-known exception. So here we have She Yeshalem, who will repay or who will reward. And we don't need to worry about this exception in our test because the name Yehovah is not a PL verb. I don't even need to defend this. You can ask anyone you want to. It's not a PL verb and also not according to Nehemiah Gordon. So it won't reject the doubling Dagesh. It will be like this verb here or this word here, Sheyechonenu, that is not a PL and it does not reject the doubling Dagesh. So let's fill this into our table. She Yehovah with a doubling Dagesh in the Yod is what we'll find if the scribes put the true vowels on the name. But if they put the vowels of Adonai on the name, what will we find? Let's see. How is this pointed next to Aleph? Next to Aleph, it's also normally pointed with Segol, sometimes Chatev Segol, and rarely Kametz. But the point is the Aleph as a guttural letter always rejects the doubling Dagesh. Let's look at some examples. She'el, that Aleph rejects the doubling Dagesh. She'ein, the Aleph rejects the doubling Dagesh. And even here in Sha'ata, where we have Kametz, the Aleph still rejects the doubling Dagesh. So, let's fall into our table. She Adonai, we're expecting the same vowel point on the Sheen, but the Aleph rejects the doubling Dagesh, always. Whereas the Yod does not reject the doubling Dagesh. So now let's look at the manuscripts. The scribes are going to tell us by their vowel points whether the name is Yehovah or whether these are the vowels of Adonai. Here is the Aleppo Codex, Psalm 144, and we have this phrase, Ashrei ha'am sheyodewahei Elohau. Blessed are the people whose Elohim is Yod Hei Waw Hei. But now, look at the pointings here. We have this sheen attached to the name. Why is there no doubling Dagesh in the Yod? Yod does not reject the doubling Dagesh. Why would this Dagesh be rejected? Because they actually read this as She Adonai. And in She Adonai, the Aleph as a guttural letter always rejects the doubling Dagesh. So now the scribes move the vowels from She Adonai over onto the name, and we have something artificial. We have a Yod without a doubling Dagesh next to a prefixed Sheen, where it should have had one. It's because they put Adonai's vowels on the name. The scribes are telling us by their pointings that they placed Adonai's vowels on the name. Let's look at some more examples here. In the Leningrad Codex, we have She Yodewahei with no Dagesh in the Yod. In the Sassoon Codex, we have She Yodewahei with no Dagesh in the Yod. Why is there no Dagesh in this Yod? Because these vowels actually belong to Adonai, in which the Aleph of Adonai rejected the doubling Dagesh. The scribes are telling us by their pointings here, the name is not Yehovah. We're only placing Adonai's vowels on the name. They're telling us by their pointings. So these are the three important manuscripts that include the book of Psalms Aleppo Codex, Leningrad Codex, Sassoon Codex. Just to fill up the page, let's look at the Cambridge University Library 652 manuscript, and we have She, Yod, He, and still there is no Dagesh in the Yod. There's no disagreement here. All the important manuscripts agree. The vowels of She Adonai were placed on the name, in which the Aleph rejected the Dagesh, not the vowels of She Yehovah, in which the Dagesh would not be rejected. So now that we see evidence upon evidence upon evidence that prove these are the vowels of Adonai, I want to remind you of what Nehemiah Gordon teaches about these vowels on the name.
Now, one of the things I immediately saw when I looked at the Hebrew manuscripts is that the name doesn't have the vowels of Adonai. And so there I am looking at the sources, these Hebrew manuscripts, and I see in the Hebrew manuscripts they don't have the vowels of Adonai. They clearly don't.
Really? When you look in the Hebrew manuscripts, you see the name clearly does not have the vowels of Adonai? Really? What Nehemiah teaches is the opposite of what we're seeing in the Hebrew Bible manuscripts. We've already covered the difference between the composite and simple Shua in session number 3 and 4. We've covered the Cholam in session number 5. And now we're looking at linguistic evidences in the Hebrew Bible manuscripts, and the evidence is overwhelming. The evidence tell us, these tests that we do tell us over and over that these are the vowels of Adonai. How is it possible that Nehemiah Gordon teaches the opposite? Let's move on to evidence number 6, the interrogative pronoun ma. Ma means what or how. And when it is not attached by Makif, the rules of pointing are too complex to cover today. But when it is attached by Makif, the rules are very simple and straightforward and precise. And that is what we need to do a test. So, this little stripe there is called Makif. It joins two words together. Although in the printed versions Makif is a long stripe, the length of a consonant, in the Hebrew manuscripts Makif is usually very short. And that's because, let's look at an example here in Mayakar. The space between that Yod and that Hey is extremely small. So that tiny little thing between the Hey and the Yod is the Makif. Secondly, we can also look at the word Ma, and we see it does not have an accent on it. That means it's joined by Makif. Alright, so we have two ways of seeing that this Ma is joined by Makif. We see this tiny little thing between the Hey and the Yod, and we see there's no accent on the word Ma. So let's look at the rules of pointing. How is Ma pointed next to a Yod? When attached by Makif, it's pointed with a patach on the mem and a doubling dagesh into the following consonant. So we have Mayakar, how precious, that is the patach, and that is the doubling dagesh. As you can see, a Yod does not reject this doubling dagesh. Let's look at the next example. Here we have Ma Yedidot, that tiny little thing there is the Makif. Ma Yedidot means how lovely, and this word Yedidot begins with Yod and simple Shua, just as we would have in Yehovah. Now when we attach this Ma, it still has a patach, and we still have a doubling dagesh in the Yod. And like I said earlier, the exception is the PL, Ma Yedaber, what he will speak. It's very well known exception that this PL imperfect rejects this doubling dagesh. And like I said, we don't need to worry about this. The name Yehovah is not a PL verb. The name Yehovah is what you get when you read and write Hebrew in the wrong direction, like we discussed in session number 1. The name Yehovah is what you get when you place Adonai's vowels on the name in a grammatically correct way, as we discussed in session number 3 and 4. And other than that, I don't even need to defend it. You can ask anyone, Yehovah cannot be a PL verb. Alright, it's not going to reject the doubling dagesh. So let's fold this into the table. Ma Yehovah with patach and doubling dagesh in the Yod. How is this pointed next to Aleph? Let's see. Next to Aleph, this Ma is always pointed with kametz, and the dagesh is always rejected. And this is when it's attached by Makif. So let's look at some examples. Here we have Ma Enosh. What is man? So we don't have a space between the Hey and the Aleph. That tiny thing there is the Makif. We don't have an accent on the word Ma, So clearly it's joined to the following one by makef, and we have a kametz on this mem. The kametz is basically a patach with a dot underneath it, or a little line with a dot underneath it. And the aleph always rejects the doubling dagesh. Let's move on to some more examples here. Ma'adir. This verse actually says, Ma'adir shimcha b'chol ha'aretz. How majestic is your name in all the earth. And because this is attached to a word that begins with an aleph, the pointing is kametz. There's the makef. The aleph always rejects the doubling dagesh. One last example here. Ma'ahavti, how I love. The pointing here is kametz and no doubling dagesh, because we attach this word ma by makef to a word that begins with aleph. So although we don't have in the Hebrew Bible ma Adonai attached by makef, it's not a problem. Whenever it's attached to a word that begins with an aleph, it rejects the doubling dagesh, and the pointing on the mem is kametz. So there you can see the difference. Ma Adonai with kametz and no dagesh versus ma Yehovah with patach and dagesh. Now let's look at the manuscripts. The manuscripts themselves are going to tell us whether the name is Yehovah or whether these are actually the vowels of Adonai that were placed on the name. And as you can see, this is a double test. In the previous test, the sheen, the only indication was the absence or presence of the dagesh. Now in number 6, the absence or presence of the dagesh plus the vowel on this mem will give the answer. So let's start the Aleppo Codex. We have Ma Yodewa Hey. What is the vowel on the mem? It's a kametz. We have a stripe plus a dot underneath it. A kametz. Why is it a kametz? Because it comes from Ma Adonai. When you attach this to a word that begins with Yod, it never takes kametz. Now look at the Yod. There's no dagesh in that Yod. Why is there no dagesh in the Yod? Because these vowels you see on the screen on the name belong to the word Adonai, in which the first consonant is an aleph, a guttural letter that rejects the doubling dagesh. Let's look at more manuscripts. Leningrad Codex, Ma Yodewahe with kametz and no doubling dagesh. Cairo Codex, Ma Yodewahe with kametz and no doubling dagesh. Why? Because the scribes put Ma Adonai's vowels on the name, not the vowels of Ma Yehovah. Sassoon Codex, we have Ma Yodewahe with kametz and no doubling dagesh in the Yod. Why? Because they didn't place the true vowels on the name here. We would have found Ma Yehovah with a patach and a doubling dagesh. They put Adonai's vowels on the name. That is a kametz because it's attached theoretically to Adonai. That's how they pronounce it, and these are the vowels that they place here for us. Okay, now let's look at the Petersburg Codex, written with Babylonian vowel signs. Although they don't place vowels on the name, here we have the pronoun ma in front of the name, and it is pointed with kametz. With kametz and not with patach. What does a patach look like in the Petersburg Codex? Here you can see ma tov, how good, and that is the patach. So even here in the Petersburg Codex, we see they read this as Ma Adonai, not as Ma Yehovah. So even though in modern Hebrew both the kametz and patach are pronounced as ah, in Tiberian Hebrew, medieval Hebrew, they were pronounced differently. And to this day we have these manuscripts that preserve these two different vowel signs. And the scribes tell us by their meticulous pointings and by their precise system of pointing that these vowels we see on the name belong to Adonai. So we see here we have a double test in number 6. Not only does the vowel here on the mem tell us that these vowels come from Adonai, but the absence of the dagesh in the yod also tell us that these vowels come from Ma Adonai. They do not belong to the name itself. Let's move on to evidence number 7, the interrogative hey when attached to the name. So of course the article, the hey that represents the article, is never attached to the name, but this interrogative hey is attached to the name in one place in the Hebrew Bible. And this is going to be a very interesting test. So how is this pointed this interrogative hey normally pointed? It's normally pointed with a chatev patach. Remember, what is a chatev patach? You have the stripe, which is the patach, and the shua next to it, these two dots. Together, it's chatev patach. So this is halohu, is he not? This hey is almost like a question mark, but it comes at the beginning of the sentence in Hebrew. Halanu ata, do you belong to us, or are you for us? Hashomarim, in context, whether they would keep. It's almost like a question. So it's normally pointed with chatev patach. Now, how is this pointed next to a word that begins with yeh? Rule number 2 says this interrogative hey is pointed with a full patach next to a guttural and next to a shua. So here we have ha'im. This is a full patach without a shua next to it because the following consonant is a guttural. Here we have hamme'at, and here we have a full patach because you can't repeat another shua there next to this shua on the mem. You can't have two shuas back to back at the beginning of a word. That's the general rule. And here they avoid it by placing a full patach on the hey. And now we get to an important example. Ha yedatem. Normally the word begins with yod and shua. Yedatem. Now it's ha yedatem. Do you know? So if the name begins with ye, as here in yedatem, we will find ha yedatem, we will find ha Yehovah. Okay? Ha Yehovah with full patach. Okay. How would this be pointed next to Adonai? So first of all, you might think it would be pointed in the exact same way, because here we have ha'im next to an aleph, and here we have ha yedatem next to yod with shua. And here we even have ha'asher. Adonai begins with aleph and chatev patach. So you'll think that it would be ha'adonai. Except that we know from many other examples in the Hebrew Bible that when we have a patach and a chatev patach next to each other on the word Adonai, it contracts. And we covered this in the previous session, that Ba'adonai contracts to Badonai. And La Adonai contracts to Ladonai. And Wa Adonai contracts to Wadonai. And even Ka Adonai contracts to Kadonai. So we know that Ha Adonai would also contract to Hadonai. Because when you have this patach on the prefix, the chatev patach on Adonai drops away. It's a standard contraction for the word Adonai. So here we have the difference. Hadonai with no vowel on the aleph versus Ha Yehovah with a vowel sign, in this case a shua on the yod. Now let's look at the most important Hebrew manuscripts, and the scribes are going to tell us by the vowel points whether they put Hadonai's vowels on the name or Ha Yehovah's vowels on the name. Here we have the Aleppo Codex, and we have Ha Yodeh Hey Ein B'Tzion. Is Yodeh Hey not in Zion? Based on the consonants. But when you look at the vowels, what do we see? We see Ha, and what happened to the vowel underneath the Yod? There's no vowel underneath the Yod here. In Ha Yehovah, there would have been a vowel there. There's no reason for that shua to drop away. In fact, you can just, by looking at this word, you can see it's artificial. They place the vowels of Hadonai on the name, in which the vowel on the aleph has dropped, and the vowel here on the yod represents the vowel of the aleph of Adonai. Now, just keep in mind that there is a small number of manuscripts, or a small percentage of manuscripts, in which we cannot do this test. There are these manuscripts that in which the scribes who wrote them used a simple shua to represent a silent aleph. And we talked a lot about this in the previous session. Here we have Le Elohim, the aleph is silent, and here we have Le Elohim's vowels on the name, and there is a shua on the yod. In this style of pointing, the scribes used a simple shua to represent the silent aleph of Le Elohim, Ladonai, Hadonai, and so on. So you'll have a shua there anyway to represent the silent aleph. in these manuscripts, test number 7 is neutral. It doesn't give an answer either way. Okay? But in the Aleppo Codex and the other important manuscripts, we can do the test. Because when we look at the exact same passage, Le'Elohim's vowels being placed on the name, in the Aleppo Codex, the scribe did not use a simple schwa to represent the silent aleph. He decided that if the aleph has no vowel sign, the yod that represents the aleph of Le'Elohim or Ladonai or Hadonai and so on does not get a vowel sign either. So in the important manuscripts, we can do test number 7, and clearly it says Hadonai. It does not indicate Ha Yehovah. We would have had a schwa there. Let's look at the other important manuscripts. Leningrad Codex, we have Ha Yod He with no vowel underneath the Yod. So these are the vowels of Hadonai in which that vowel dropped. In Cairo Codex, we have Ha Yod He with no vowel sign underneath the Yod. In the Sassoon Codex, we have Ha Yod He with no vowel underneath the Yod. That stripe there is the meta. You can also see it up here. It's not a vowel sign. These are the vowels of Hadonai that are placed on the name. The manuscripts agree. So these are the 4 important manuscripts that include this verse or preserve this verse for us, and they all agree. The vowels of Hadonai were placed on the name. Just remember that there's this small group of manuscripts in which silent aleph is represented by a simple schwa, and in those manuscripts we cannot do test number 7. Okay, now as we see all these evidences from the Hebrew Bible manuscripts, I want to remind you what Nehemiah Gordon teaches about the vowels on the name.
And I was told this is common knowledge. Well, as I was doing my research at the Hebrew University, one of the things I found is that in fact, God's name, as it's written by the scribes, isn't written with the vowels of Adonai, the Hebrew word for Lord. That's factually untrue. They say that as a fact, but it's factually untrue. And I was told this is common knowledge. Well, as I was doing my research at the Hebrew University, one of the things I found is that in fact, God's name, as it's written by the scribes, isn't written with the vowels of Adonai, the Hebrew word for Lord. That's factually untrue. They say that as a fact, but it's factually untrue.
Have you ever wondered why people say it as a fact that the scribes put the vowels of Adonai on the name? I wonder why. Now let's move on to evidence number 8. Now evidence number 8 is going to be a bit more complicated than the other 7 evidences, but I'll try to explain it to you in a way that you'll understand it even if you don't know Hebrew. And we'll be talking about open and closed syllables, conjunctive and disjunctive accents, and we will see that there is an 8th test that we can do in which the scribes tell us whether the vowels on the name belong to the name itself or whether it belongs to Adonai. Okay, so let's talk about these 6 Hebrew letters. The Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Kaf, Pei, and Tau. Now, to keep it easy, people refer to these as the Begad Kafat letters. So you use one word to refer to these 6 letters. And these have 2 distinct pronunciations in Tiberian Hebrew. And even in modern Hebrew, some of these letters, like the Beit and the Kaf and the Pei, still have 2 different pronunciations. But in the Hebrew Bible, in the manuscripts, all 6 of these letters have 2 different pronunciations. A hard pronunciation, and that's when the scribes put a dot inside these letters called a dagesh, and a softer pronunciation when the dagesh is omitted from these 6 letters. Okay, so let's look at rule number 1. Normally, these 6 Hebrew letters, the Begad Kafat letters, take dagesh at the beginning of a word. So here we see Ki ma'as, for he rejected or for he refused, and there's a dagesh in the kaf at the beginning of a word. Here we have bamot, high places. There's a dagesh in this beit at the beginning of the word. And here we see gam manochi, also I, and there's a dagesh in that gimel at the beginning of a word. That's just a general rule. Now, when is this dagesh omitted from the Begad Kafat letters? And to keep it simple, we're talking about this at the beginning of a word. Inside a word, it's more complex. But at the beginning of a word, when is this dagesh omitted from the Begad Kafat letters? When it is preceded by an open syllable plus a conjunctive accent. So let's explain this. What does it mean? Here we have Yashar yechazu fanemo. The upright will see his face. So this word yechazu ends in a vowel. That vowel is called shurek. It's an oo sound. And a syllable that ends in a vowel is called an open syllable. A syllable that ends in a consonant, as for example here, yashar, the syllable shar ends in a consonant, that's a closed syllable. So this word ends in an open syllable, but also it has a conjunctive accent written on it. That accent there is called mercha or mercha, and it tells you not to pause on the word you're pronouncing, but to read together with the following word. So what happened is the people were pronouncing this as yechazu fanemo, as one word almost, and so at the end of this word yechazu, your mouth is open and you're pronouncing a vowel, and you're not ready to pronounce a hard pay, so you pronounce a soft instead of a hard p. So instead of yechazu panemo, it's yechazu fanemo. Alright, let's look at some more examples, so that pei does not have a dagesh inside it. Here we have achat ola veit el, one of which goes up toward Beth El, and this word ola ends in an open syllable, ah. As you can see there, we have a rafeh above it, but whether or not you have a rafeh above the hey, it's an open syllable. Kamet say is an open syllable. The final hey in this situation is a vowel letter. It does not close the syllable, and this accent here is conjunctive. It's called munach, and so it's ola veit el, with a soft pronunciation of the beit, because the previous word ends in an open syllable. And this is what would happen with Yehovah. Yehovah ends in an open syllable with a kametz hey. It does not close the syllable. So if Yehovah has a conjunctive accent on it, the following Bagat Kafat letter will not have a dagesh, just as we see here in Ola Veit El. Let's look at the final example here. Ir v'yoshevei vach, a city and those who dwell in it. And this word yoshevei ends in an open syllable. This is called tzerei yod. The yod is part of the vowel tzerei. It does not close the syllable. And again, this accent mercha. So you read this together with the following word, and it's not v'yoshevei bah, it's v'yoshevei vah, with a soft beit, because the previous word ends in an open syllable plus conjunctive accent. And this is only true when the word also has a conjunctive accent. Because let's look at some examples where we have an open syllable plus a disjunctive accent, an accent that tells you to pause. So here we have waya'asu peri. This word ends in u, just like yechazu. So why is it yechazu fanemo, but it's waya'asu peri? It's because this word waya'asu has the accent revia mugrash on it. It tells you to pause at that word. So you say waya'asu, pause, okay, ready to pronounce a hard pay, peri. Whereas in the other example, you pronounce these two together and you say yechazu fanemo. Let's look at some more examples. So there is a dagesh in that pay because the previous word has a disjunctive accent on it. Here we have kiata tavi, and that tau there has a dagesh inside it, indicating the hard pronunciation of the tau. Why? Because here we have just as we had in ola. Here we have ta, and then a hard tau next to it, because we have a disjunctive accent on this word called revia. Kiata, pause, tavi. Alright, one last example here. V'charbi tochal. And this word charbi ends in an open syllable, chirek yod, in which the yod is part of the vowel chirek. Why do we have a hard tau with a dagesh inside it? Because the previous word charbi has a disjunctive accent on it called a tifcha, and so you say charbi, pause, hard tau. So let me show you in the table what the conclusion is. When we find the word yod hey waw hey with a conjunctive accent on it, so it's read together with the following word, and the name is Yehovah. The name ends in an open syllable. Yehovah ends in an open syllable, and we'll find a soft beit next to it pronounced v instead of b. We'll find a soft kaf next to it pronounced ch instead of k. In modern Hebrew they say ch. So even in modern Hebrew, this beit, kaf, and also the pei is pronounced differently with and without the dagesh. Now, how about Adonai? If these vowels on the name belong to Adonai, what will we find? So, rule 1c, these letters, the Begat Kafat letters, also take a dagesh at the beginning of a word when preceded by a closed syllable plus conjunctive accent. What does that mean? Here we have V'charbi tochal basar. This word tochal has the conjunctive accent munach on it, and you read these two words together, tochal basar. Why is there a dagesh in the beit? Because the previous word closed the syllable. This lamed of tochal closed the syllable. Now the really interesting thing is that the diphthong I, as we have in Adonai, closes the syllable. So here we can see an example of it. Avshai ben Tzeruya. Avshai ben Tzeruya with a hard beit, a dagesh inside this beit. Why? Because the yod here is not a part of the vowel ah. It's a consonant. It forms a diphthong and it closes the syllable. Avshai ben Tzeruya, not Avshai ben Tzeruya. And the exact same thing happens with Adonai. Even though it's Kametz yod, the yod still closes the syllable. So here we have Adonai darashti. This accent here is called galgal, also called yerach. It's a conjunctive accent. We read these two words together, Adonai darashti, and we have a hard dalet with a dagesh inside it, because Adonai closes the syllable. So in our table, even if we have a conjunctive accent on the word Adonai, the following Begat Kafat letter will have its hard pronunciation with a dagesh inside. Whereas in Yehovah, we will find this soft pronunciation without the dagesh. Now, before we actually do this test with a name, I first want to show you that it really works, and that we can actually use this test, number 8, to prove whether a certain word in the Hebrew Bible has dummy vowels written on it or its true vowels written on it. So we talked about Kativ Krei Perpetuum in session number 3. Kativ Krei Perpetuum is where a certain word in the Hebrew Bible is always or perpetually read or pronounced differently than the way it's written in a specific situation. So what do we have here? We have, based on the consonants, haaretz, hahu, the land, the he, or that land, using a masculine that to refer back to a feminine land. So they don't read it that way by tradition. They read this as haaretz, hahi, the land, the she, or that land, using a feminine that to refer back to the land. And what they do is they put the dummy vowel of the word he, the Hebrew word he, on the Hebrew word who. But because this occurs more than 100 times, nearly 200 times in the Torah, they don't tell you in the margin to read it differently. So you can look here in the Aleppo Codex, in Deuteronomy 29, there's no note in the margin telling you how to read this word. So some people mock the Kativ Krei Perpetuum theory, and they say, oh, it's imaginary. They don't tell you in the margin how to read it, so it's all imaginary. Well, I want to show you that I can prove from the Masoretic text itself that this word has a dummy vowel on it, and that this dummy vowel belongs to the Hebrew word he. And how are we going to prove this? Because if you read what's actually written here in the text, you read the hey, then the cherek, then the waw or the vav. You read this as heave or hiu. This waw or vav, no matter how you pronounce it, closes the syllable. Whereas in he, the yod is part of the vowel cherek, and the aleph is silent. So the word he does not close the syllable, but if you read this as heave or hiu, pronouncing what's actually written here, then the syllable is closed. And so using this argument of the open and closed syllable will prove beyond any shadow of a doubt whether this vowel here is a dummy vowel or the true vowel of the word it's written on. So let's look at some examples here. And we'll have to use the Leningrad Codex because remember, most of the Torah has been lost from the Aleppo Codex. These passages we need to look at do not exist anymore in the Aleppo Codex. So here we have the word in question, Hey Waw Aleph with the Cherek. Was this pronounced as heave, the way it's written black and white, or was this pronounced as he with a dummy vowel written on it? We can test it in this passage because this accent here is conjunctive, it's a mercha, and the following word on the next line begins with a beit, which is a begat kafat letter. So, if this closes the syllable, if this is really pronounced as heave or hiu, then we will find hiu ba'enayim with a hard bait. But what do we find here in the Bible? We find this word in question and va'enayim with a soft bait. What does this tell us about the previous or the preceding word? It tells us that the preceding word ends in an open syllable. In other words, if you read this as heave or hiu, that's not what the Masoretes intended for you to do. They placed that vowel there to represent the Hebrew word he, which leaves the syllable open, so that you read this as he va'enayim, not heave ba'enayim. The only problem that there is with this test is that there is a tiny chance, a very small chance, that this could be an exception. And so it is not a good idea to base our conclusion on one single example, because there's a small chance that this one single example could perhaps be an exception. But if we look at multiple examples, there's no way that we're looking at the exception, we're looking at the rule. So let's look at some more examples of this. Here again we have the word in question, and it has the conjunctive accent meupach written on it. So you're going to read these two words together, and the following word begins with a kaf, which is a begat kafat letter. So, was this read as heave kesuto, or was this read as he chesuto with a soft kaf? Look there, there's no dagesh in the kaf. There's no dagesh in the kaf. This tells us that the previous word, the vowel on the previous word, belongs to a word that leaves the syllable open. Remember, the consonants and the vowel points are two separate systems. Whether or not the word that's actually written here in consonants close the syllable is not the question. But the question is, this vowel point here, does it belong to this word, or does it belong to a different word? And the fact that here we don't have a dagesh in the kaf tells us that the vowel point on the preceding word belongs to a word that leaves a syllable open. So this was read as he chesuto with a soft kaf, not heave kesuto with a hard kaf. Now with two examples, there's not really a chance that both these could be exceptions. Really, just with two examples we can be pretty sure that this is a dummy vowel. But let's keep going and look at two more examples so that we can make 100% sure we know what the answer is. So here we have the word in question with the conjunctive accent munach, and the following letter is a kaf. And again, it's a soft kaf. So this was read as wehi cheha, not wehiv keha. The absence of the dagesh here tells us that the previous word's vowel belongs to a word that leaves a syllable open. One last example here. The word in question with munach, and followed by a word that begins with kaf. And again we see that this was read as wehi cheha, not wehiv keha. This is the only linguistic evidence that I know of to prove that the vowel you see here written on this word is a dummy vowel, and that this word, the way it's written black and white, is a gibberish word. And yet it is such a strong evidence that there's no arguing about it. No one has to argue about it. The scribes told us by their vowel pointings that this is a dummy vowel, and we can do the exact same test with the name. The exact same test. So let's just remind ourselves, what is the difference between Yehovah and Adonai? How will we do the test? Here we have Achat Olav et El. If the name is Yehovah, it ends in A, just like this word Olah, and the following Begat Kafat letter will therefore have its soft pronunciation if Yehovah has a conjunctive accent on it. Whereas if those vowels are really the vowels of Adonai, remember here, were Avshai ben Tzeruya and Adonai Darashti, where we have, although we have a conjunctive accent on this word that ends in I, the following Begat Kafat letter has a dagesh inside it because Adonai closes the syllable. So, back to our table, if it's Yehovah, we'll find Yehovah V, and we'll find Yehovah Ch. But if those vowels belong to Adonai, we'll find the name and then B, or the name and then K, with a hard pronunciation. So now let's look at the manuscripts, and we'll do one letter at a time, working through these 5 consonants. The Pei never occurs next to the name with conjunctive accent, and the scribes are going to tell us by their pointings whether the pronunciation Yehovah is authentic, the true pronunciation of the name, or whether Yehovah is like pronouncing this other Hebrew word as Hev. They're going to tell us by their pointings. So let's start here in the Aleppo Codex. Yodeh Wahei with the conjunctive accent Munach, and the following consonant is a beit. So it's Yodeh Wahei Bachem. What does this dagesh in the beit tell us? It tells us that the previous word, although it has a conjunctive accent, does not end in a vowel. It does not end in an open syllable, because then it would have been Yehovah Vachem. So we see that these vowels of the name belong to Adonai, in which the last syllable is closed. They do not belong to Yehovah, in which the last syllable is open. Now again, there's a very small chance that this one example could be an exception. So let's look at multiple examples so that we can make 100% sure we are looking at the rule. We're not just looking at one strange exception. So here again we have Yodeh Wahei with a conjunctive accent, and the following consonant is a beit, and it has a dagesh inside it. This dagesh tells us that the vowels on the previous word belong to a word in which the last syllable is closed. In other words, they belong to Adonai, Adonai b'yad, not Yehovah v'yad. Let's look at the other manuscripts. Leningrad Codex, Yodeh Wahei with conjunctive accent and a dagesh in the following beit. And the Cairo Codex, conjunctive accent, Tilisha Ketana, and a dagesh in the following beit. So this is not supposed to be read as Yehovah v'charbo. You read this as Adonai b'charbo. Adonai closes the syllable, and the following Begat Kafat letter takes a dagesh. So just like this evidence told us that Hev is a gibberish word, so this evidence tells us that Yehovah is not a genuine Hebrew word. The vowels on the name belong to Adonai, in which the last syllable is closed. Sassoon 507 manuscript, the Damascus Crown, has Yodeh Wahei with the conjunctive accent Melcha and a dagesh in the following beit. Sassoon Codex, Yodeh Wahei with the conjunctive accent Munach and a dagesh in the following beit. All these manuscripts give the same answer. The vowels on the name belong to a word in which the last syllable is closed. They belong to Adonai, not to the name Yehovah. Now, I won't be showing you many examples from the Petersburg Codex, because remember, it's written with Babylonian vowel signs, and also most of the accent signs look different. But here we have a good example where the accent looks exactly the same as the Tiberian equivalent, and this accent is called Kadma, conjunctive accent. And the following beit there has a dagesh in it. So even though the scribes did not place any vowels on the name here, we know that what they read instead of the name was read together with the following word. The conjunctive accent tells us, and we have a dagesh in the following word. So they too read this as Adonai ba'amo. They did not read this as Yehovah ba'amo. Now, in this manuscript, that is not necessarily a rafeh. That is a shwa there. We have a dagesh inside this beit. So let's fall into our table what we saw. Yodeh Wahei with a conjunctive accent next to beit. The beit always has a dagesh. Always. And this tells us that the vowels on the name belong to Adonai, in which the last syllable is closed. Now, let's quickly work through the other consonants. These are not separate tests. We're continuing the same test. All these Begat Kafat letters follow the same rule. And I just want to show you multiple evidences. And so you can see that this works the same with all 5 of these consonants. The scribes give us the answer. The vowels on the name belong to Adonai. So here's Yod-Heh next to Gimel. It has the conjunctive accent Kadma, and the Gimel has a Dagesh inside it. Another example, Yod-Heh with the conjunctive accent Telisha Ketana, and the Gimel has a Dagesh inside it. How about the other manuscripts? Leningrad Codex has a Dagesh inside the Gimel. Cairo Codex, there's a Dagesh inside the Gimel. Sassoon Codex, there's a Dagesh inside the Gimel. Okay? So all the manuscripts give the same answer. The vowels on the name belong to a word in which the last syllable is closed. So although you read together with the following word, you have a hard Gimel and Beit and so on. They do not belong to Yehovah, in which the last syllable would be open, and we would find a soft Gimel and a soft Dalet. Let's continue with Dalet. Here we have Yod-Heh with Merka, conjunctive accent, Dever, with a hard Dalet, a Dagesh inside. Here we have Yod-Heh Darkecha, with a hard Dalet. Let's go to the other manuscripts. Leningrad Codex, Yod-Heh with conjunctive accent, and a Dagesh inside the Dalet. And here we have the Cairo Codex. So this is the name Yod-Heh. We know this not only from other manuscripts, but we can see the Yod there, the Shua there, the Kametz there. You can see part of the Waw, and you can see the final Hey. As the conjunctive accent Meupach, Dibarti, with a hard Dagesh, a hardening Dagesh in the Dalet. And there in the Sassoon Codex, Yod-Heh with Munach Darkecha. So all the manuscripts agree. All these important manuscripts agree. The scribes are telling us by their pointings that the vowels on the name belong to Adonai, in which the last syllable is closed. Sassoon 507, Yod-Heh with Merka, and followed by a hard Dalet. And in the 4445, the same thing. There's no disagreement. We don't know of any exceptions we need to worry about here. We always get the same answer. Let's move on to Kaf. Yod-Heh with the conjunctive accent Munach, followed by a hard Kaf. Yod-Heh Ki Tov. Let's look at this interesting phrase here. If you read the the consonants, it's Hodu, Lamed preposition on Yod-Heh Ki Tov. So it's give thanks to Yod-Heh, for he is good. But what do the vowels say? The vowels say Hodu Ladonai Ki Tov. The vowel on the Lamed preposition tells us this is Ladonai, not Lihovah. Not only that, the name has a conjunctive accent written on it, and the following kaf is a hard kaf with a Dagesh inside it. This is as clear as day. This is not Hodu Lihovah Ki Tov. This is Hodu Ladonai Ki Tov. Very clear. Here are multiple examples from the Aleppo Codex, different places in the Psalms where we have the same phrase. It always gives the same answer. Let's look at the other manuscripts. Yod-Heh Ketsid Ki with a hard kaf. Yod-Heh Ketsid Ki with a hard kaf in the Sassoon Codex. There's no disagreement here. 4445, Yod-Heh with the accent Meupach, Kol Bakor. So let's just read this. Vayaharog Yod-Heh Kol Bakor Beretz Mitzrayim. Then Yod-Heh slew every firstborn in the land of Egypt. And although the name here has a conjunctive accent written on it, the following kaf has its hard pronunciation. The same year in the Sassoon 507, the Damascus crown. Although the name has its full set of vowels, so-called full set of vowels, Shua, Cholam, Kametz, the following kaf is hard. This tells us this was not pronounced as Yehovah Kol Bechor. This was pronounced as Adonai Kol Bechor with a hard kaf. The vowels here, Shua, Cholam, Kametz, belong to Adonai, in which the last syllable is closed, based on the Hebrew manuscripts themselves. So now only Tau is left. Remember, we don't have examples of Yod-Heh with conjunctive accent next to Pei. So let's move on to Tau. Aleppo Codex, Yod-Heh with Munach, followed by a hard Tau. Leningrad Codex, let's just read this phrase, Torat Yod-Heh Temimah. The Torah of Yod-Heh is perfect or complete. And yet, if you look at the pointings, you have a hard Tau. A hard Tau. So this is not Torat Yehovah Temimah with a soft Tau. This is Torat Adonai Temimah with a hard Tau, based on the manuscript itself. Other manuscripts, here's another example from the Leningrad Codex. Here's the Cairo Codex with Merkah and a Dagesh in the Tau. Although this is not a very good scan, we can still see the Dagesh there. Sassoon Codex, Yod-Heh with Munach, followed by a hard Tau. All the manuscripts agree. There is no disagreement here. The vowels on the name belong to Adonai, in which the last syllable is closed. They do not belong to the name Yehovah, in which the last syllable would be open. And so yes, there is a chance that one of the examples I showed you could be an exception. And you could even argue that perhaps two of the examples I showed you could be exceptions. But that means more than 20 of the examples I've showed you are not exceptions. We're looking at the rule. Can you see the evidence is overwhelming? I do not know of a single evidence in the Hebrew Bible that proves the name is Yehovah. I know of 8 evidences that prove the name is not Yehovah, that prove these are the vowels of Adonai. And I do not know of any Hebrew manuscripts in which these 5 tests say the name is Yehovah. Nehemiah Gordon has never shown any Hebrew Bible manuscripts in which these 5 tests prove the name is Yehovah. We do not know of any such evidence. All the evidence we know of tell us that these are the vowels of Adonai. So, as we're finishing up on this argument, let's just remind ourselves, what does Nehemiah Gordon teach about the vowels on the name?
Now, one of the things I was told, and everyone knows, it's a fact, it's common knowledge, which is that the vowels of the name Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh in the Bible are the vowels of Adonai, which means Lord. And I immediately saw, as I was reading these manuscripts, that was simply, it was a fact and it was common knowledge, but it was factually untrue, like provably, definitively just untrue.
Okay. Now, this is coming from someone whose actual job it is to be a proofreader, proofreaders, so that the scientific, the most accurate version of the most important Hebrew document in the Jewish world is accurate.
Right.
And so this isn't,
right.
You know,
well, but really, you didn't have to be a proofreader to see that when you looked in the mass manuscripts of the Bible, and particularly at that time I had access to the Leningrad Codex and the Aleppo Codex. You'd be like me saying I have a full set of purple hair, right? You don't need to be a hairdresser to know that's not true, right?
It's that obvious.
It was that obvious that the name Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh did not have the vowels of Adonai.
How is this possible? How is it possible that Nehemiah Gordon is teaching us something that's factually untrue, and that is the opposite of what we see in the Hebrew Bible manuscript? Like I said, have you ever wondered why it's a fact and common knowledge that the scribes put Adonai's vowels on the name? Because the evidence is overwhelming. Nehemiah talks about the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad Codex. These are the manuscripts we looked at today: the Aleppo Codex, Leningrad Codex, Cairo Codex, Sassoon 507, Sassoon 1053, British Library 4445. We're looking at the most important manuscripts in the world, and the scribes are telling us in 8 different ways. We've covered 8 different proofs in the last 2 sessions that prove the vowels on the name belong to Adonai. This is what the Hebrew Bible manuscripts say. I'm not rejecting the evidence of the Hebrew Bible manuscripts. I'm accepting it. In fact, the Hebrew Bible manuscripts is the number 1 evidence I have. The tests that we have done in these last 2 sessions are the most accurate and definitive tests that I know of to prove that the name is not Yehovah, and that prove that these are the vowels of Adonai. Now let's draw a conclusion here. Nehemiah Gordon says that he found written black and white in the Hebrew Bible manuscripts that the name is Yehovah.
This was my prayer for years. Father, I'm paraphrasing, right? But my prayer for years was, Father, when I stand before you in the day of judgment and you say, why did you pronounce the name that way? I'll be able to say to the Creator, this is how I found it written in black and white in the manuscripts of your word.
What does it mean to say, I see something black and white in the Hebrew Bible? We can say here, we see black and white. There is such a Hebrew word as heave. Alright, now if you want to pronounce this as heave, because that's the way it's written black and white in the important Hebrew Bible manuscripts, and in fact in thousands of manuscripts across the world, it's up to you and it's your choice, but there is one very firm linguistic evidence that I shared with you earlier today that proves this is a gibberish word the way it's written. This is a dummy vowel you see there, it belongs to a different word. One evidence, and that evidence is firm enough that I'm not going to pronounce this as heave. I'm either going to pronounce it as he based on the vowel, or I'm going to find a different place to get the true vowels for this word hey, wow, aleph. And we don't need to go outside the Masoretic text. We can use the Masoretic text itself to determine what the true vowel or vowels of this word is. Is it going to make any difference if I discover 10,000 manuscripts in which it's black and white, heave? It's not going to make any difference. Find manuscripts in which this word closed the syllable. That could make a difference to the argument. Now, if you want to pronounce the name as Yehovah, because that's the way it's written black and white in the Aleppo Codex, in the Leningrad Codex, and in many other Hebrew Bible manuscripts, it's your choice. But we know of two firm linguistic evidences that tell us these are not the vowels of the name, these are the vowels of Elohim. Is it going to make any difference if I discover 1,000,000 manuscripts that read black and white Yehovah? No, it's not going to make any difference. Find manuscripts that read Lehovah. Find manuscripts that always write Yehovah and never change it when not written next to Adonai. That could make a difference to the argument. Now, if you want to pronounce this as Yehovah, the Creator's name as Yehovah, because that's the way it's written in the Aleppo Codex, Leningrad Codex, and in thousands of other Hebrew Bible manuscripts, it's up to you, but we have 8 firm tests, 8 clear evidences from the scribes themselves in these Hebrew Bible manuscripts that tell us these vowels do not belong to the name, they belong to Adonai. And if we discover 1,000,000 manuscripts that read black and white Yehovah, it's not going to change these 8 technical linguistic evidences. It's not going to change these 8 ways in which the scribes tell us these are dummy vowels. If Nehemiah wants to prove the name is Yehovah, he needs to show us manuscripts in which we have 8 technical evidences that say the name is Yehovah. We don't know of any single Hebrew manuscript in which these 8 tests say the name is Yehovah. Not one. In fact, we don't know of a single Hebrew manuscript in which one of these tests prove the name is Yehovah. Remember that in some manuscripts you will find, where is this? Evidence number 7. You will find a schwa there, but only in manuscripts that always use a schwa to indicate silent aleph. Alright? So we don't have any evidence from Hebrew Bible manuscripts to prove the name is Yehovah. All the evidence tells us that that is a false pronunciation. So let's sum up. What did we learn? We learned that 8 Hebrew particles or phrases prove definitively that the vowels on the name are those of Adonai. Nehemiah's B52 bomber argument is misrepresented, inaccurate, and false when tested with the vowels of Elohim. And this applies not only to this Rafeh on the Hey we covered today, but also to the La Yehovah argument we covered in the previous session. There is much more evidence that the vowels of Yehovah are the vowels of Adonai than there is evidence that the vowels of Yehovah are those of Elohim. It is much more incorrect to say the name is Yehovah than to say the name is Yehovah. There are only 2 evidences against Yehovah. There are 8 evidences in the Hebrew Bible against Yehovah. On the other hand, Nehemiah Gordon teaches that in the B52 bomber that I found the Hey of Yod-Heh-Wah's name proves definitively that the name is Yehovah. Did he never check? The first thing you should check is to see what did the scribes do with Elohim's vowels. This tells me that Nehemiah Gordon either never checked or he doesn't care. One of the two. Nehemiah says it's factually, provably, definitively untrue that the vowels on the name are the vowels of Adonai. We've now investigated this in 5 sessions. We've looked at the difference between the composite Shua and the simple Shua, the Cholim, and we've also looked at 8 proofs from the Masoretic text itself. Wherever we looked, the manuscripts say Adonai's vowels were placed on the name. So we see that what Nehemiah teaches is factually untrue based on the Hebrew Bible manuscripts. Is this ignorance or dishonesty? Did Nehemiah Gordon never check? Or is he ignoring the evidence? And I think it's time that we answer this question. Is Nehemiah ignorant or dishonest? So, in session number 8, is Nehemiah Gordon a trustworthy, reliable, honest Hebrew scholar? And we'll talk about Nehemiah's claims about the words Yahavah, Ahava, and Yehovah in John chapter 17. And we'll do this in the following session, number 8. And if you don't know the Hebrew alphabet, I encourage you to memorize that, to learn it, because that's all you need to understand the conclusion I'll draw in the following session. You won't have to rely on me. You can rely on your own 2 eyes if you only know the Hebrew alphabet. So until then, Shalom and Yeshua Mashiach.